Midgerai an céad vír eile sin gnó príváideach na máil agus go háirid tairiscint maidiúir le fionraí an cheanglis grinscrúdú a dhéanamh an mille cosc í halvia fihe. Moving on to private members' business, and specifically a motion re-suspension of scrutiny requirement for the Eviction Ban Bill 2022. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Thanks, Last Count Corla. I'll be sharing time, 8 minutes for myself, 4 for Deputy Kenny and 8 for Deputy Murphy.
If you could formally move the motion.
Yeah, so I formally move People for Profit motion, which is People for Profit Solidarity, motion to waive the pre-legislative scrutiny requirement on our Eviction Ban Bill, which passed second stage in the Dáil in February of this year, but nothing has happened. It hasn't progressed since then, and we believe it is a matter of urgency that our bill does progress and that we reinstate, either through our bill or if the government want to do it themselves, we'd be more than happy to reinstate an emergency ban on no-fault evictions, which we think is a matter of absolute urgency. And I just want to say, Minister, there is no acceptable level of homelessness. And I really hope the government get that, because the hardship, the suffering and the trauma that families, individuals and worst of all children are suffering, who are threatened with homelessness or then made homeless, in the vast majority of cases because they are evicted when they have done nothing wrong. And they've done nothing wrong, where they've paid the rent, they haven't engaged in antisocial behaviour, often living in private rented accommodation for years and years and years, and then are evicted into homelessness and facing the terror, the fear of being put into emergency accommodation and with no options in many cases to get out of there, because there are, between the various lists, 160,000 households on the various lists, social housing lists, because rents are completely off the Richter scale, totally unaffordable for the vast majority of people. So if you are pushed into homelessness through no fault of your own, you are in deep trouble. You are very, very scared, often with children. Now, 12,800 individuals, of which just under 4,000 are children, suffering that trauma, that hardship, that terror of being homeless. And there is absolutely no doubt that the government's decision to lift the eviction ban has made the situation worse. And to be honest, I find it Orwellian that the government claims this is not the case. So let's just look at the trajectory of homelessness in this country. In July 2014, there were 3,258 people homeless. By January 2020, that had gone up to 10,200, a tripling over those years. The only period where the number of people in homelessness reduced was when the eviction ban was brought in during the COVID pandemic. The only time. And it went from January 2020, 10,200, down to 7,900 between then and May 2021, when that emergency ban was lifted towards the end of the pandemic. So there was a dramatic reduction in the number of people being driven into homelessness during the first ban on evictions during COVID. Ever since then, it has gone up. Now, the government say, well, when we brought in the second temporary ban for a few months in the winter of 2022 that it didn't stop the number of people going into homelessness, therefore it wasn't working. Now, it is true, people continued to enter homelessness, but the vast, vast majority of those did so because they had received the notice to quit prior to the introduction of the temporary ban. So the temporary ban didn't cover them, something we pointed out at the time, that people would still be made homeless during the temporary ban because the ban did not cover notices to quit that had already expired. But it is absolutely clear that the number entering homeless did reduce. The overall figures increased, but the number entering into homelessness reduced. And then, of course, when you made the disastrous decision to lift the second temporary eviction ban, the numbers began to climb dramatically. March 2023, 11,988 people in emergency accommodation. Latest figures, July 2023, 12,847, of which, as I said, nearly 4,000 children. So we have seen, in other words, over the period since the decision of the government to lift the temporary eviction ban, an additional 1,093 people have entered homelessness and emergency accommodation, of which 398 are children. We have also seen a dramatic increase in the number of notices to quit issued. So in the first quarter of 2023, there were 4,753 notices to quit. In the second quarter, that had increased to 5,735, a 21% increase in the number of notices to quit, because the government gave the green light to allow people who have done nothing wrong to be evicted. And Peter McVerry, earlier this week, speaking in support of the motion and the bill to reinstate the eviction ban, is predicting that at the current trajectory of people entering homelessness, because in most cases they are being evicted on grounds of sale or other grounds that are allowed by the government, that we will be facing potentially 16,000 families, individuals and children homeless by the time we arrive at a general election. Now, that is just shameful. It's disgusting to allow this to happen, for the government to wash their hands and say this is somehow an acceptable level of homelessness, or even worse, to put forward an Orwellian argument which suggests this is somehow improving the situation to allow these evictions because it will encourage more landlords to enter the market. I'll just say finally, one of the arguments the government has made is, oh, if we reintroduce an eviction ban, it will encourage more landlords to leave the market. The CSO brought out figures during the summer which actually showed that compared to the last census, the number of tenancies in this country has dramatically increased. Those figures are considerably higher than the registrations for the RTB, which suggests there's huge numbers of properties being purchased, often on the back of evictions, by institutional investors or by landlords, but who are failing to register with the RTB. You shouldn't be pandering to people like that. You should be doing something about it and ensuring people aren't driven into homelessness.
Thanks, Corla. Why are we here again at the start of another Dáil term, debating something that the Dáil debated previously, that the Dáil passed, our bill? Why are we here again? Because the government is deliberately blocking it, is leaving it in committee, or not even progressing it in reality to committee, because the government is opposed to the reintroduction of the eviction ban, despite the fact that the Dáil actually passed this bill to have a proper eviction ban to prevent people from being made homeless. And at the root of that is the conscious decision of the government to allow the numbers of homeless people in this state to rise higher and higher and higher so that landlords can maximise their profit. That's the essence of the decision that the government has made, and that it looks like the government is shamefully going to continue to make as we go into the winter. We know there's now almost 13,000 people homeless in emergency accommodation, 4,000 of those being children. They're the ones in emergency accommodation. In addition to that, you have to add those who are sleeping rough on our streets while the storm is approaching. You add those who are couch surfing. You add those who are living in vans, in cars, in tents in our parks. All of those people. And it is an absolute disgrace, and it's a conscious political choice. The Taoiseach yesterday, in response to Richard Boyd Barrett, argued that the last eviction ban did not work. Homelessness increased, and the number of people in emergency accommodation increased for almost every month that it was in situ. It just deferred homelessness and made a bad situation worse later. Deferring homelessness. I mean, even what he's saying is complete nonsense. But the idea that deferring homelessness would be a bad thing, that it doesn't matter to people that they have a roof over their heads tonight or tomorrow night or next month or whatever, is utterly bizarre. The idea that it made a bad situation worse is ridiculous. Yes, it's true that in the time frame of the last inadequate eviction ban, it's not the same as the eviction ban we have. It didn't bring down the numbers of people who are homeless, and the number of people, in emergency accommodation rose throughout most of those months. But it's disingenuous in the extreme by the Taoiseach, because he knows that the figures demonstrate that once the eviction ban, that the partial, inadequate eviction ban was lifted, then the homeless figures begin to rise at a much, much more rapid rate. So it made a difference. It reduced the number of people who were in emergency accommodation who were homeless. And now the government has made the decision, and is going to stick to it by the looks of it, to allow more and more people to become homeless. They seem to think that the political price of having 15,000, 16,000 people homeless is a price worth paying, as long as it means that the market can continue to operate. There was 5,700 eviction notices issued in the second quarter of this year, about 1,000 more than were issued in the first 3 months when the partial eviction ban was in place. In the 3 months since the end of the partial eviction ban, half of the single adults who became homeless said they'd been evicted from rental accommodation. All those people would have been spared homelessness if the government had put it in place. Thousands more will be spared homelessness if the government would accept this and actually implement the eviction ban. We've had 20,000 notices to quit issued this year before the start of July. And what's the government's alternative to an eviction ban? The government's alternative to an eviction ban is tax breaks for landlords. That's the government's alternative. The government's alternative is to say that landlords should pay a lower rate of tax on passive income than their renters pay on earned income that they get for going out to work. It is scandalous, shame-faced, barefaced stuff. I mean, you construct a logic for it, and I'll demonstrate how there's no basis for it, but again, people can see the reason you're doing it is because this is a government that represents the landlords. It's not a government that represents renters, it's not a government that represents homeless people. So the constructed argument by the landlord lobby is to say landlords are fleeing the sector, we're having such a difficult time and so on, we need to have tax breaks, we need to pay a lower rate of tax, and that will give stability to tenants. The truth is that there are record rents being paid in this country now. There's a record amount of money going from pockets of ordinary people into the pockets of those who own multiple properties, in particular, of course, the big corporate landlords. There was 3.1 billion paid in rent in 2016. There was 4.7 billion paid in rent to private landlords in 2022. Average weekly rent went from €200 to €273. And as Richard has pointed out, rather than this idea that the private rented sector is getting smaller, it's gotten bigger. From 2016 to 2022, the number of occupied dwellings rented from a private landlord increased by 7% to over 330,000. So this is just a manufactured argument to try to get some tax cuts and to pay even less tax than less tax than renters who are asked to pay. The alternative is extremely simple. The alternative is that if landlords want to exit the market, grand. No problem. That's not a crisis for anybody as long as the tenant gets to remain in situ. So, landlord wants to exit the market, the state should just buy the property off them at market rate. The landlord achieves what they want, which is they say they want to exit the market. Fine. The tenant gets security of tenure, gets to become a council tenant. The state gets the benefit of an asset. It stops someone becoming homeless, and now it has an asset that it will get rent from and will... That is tenant in situ, that's right.
Which we proposed.
We proposed, and that should be done everywhere. So instead of saying that we have to give these people tax breaks to stay in the market, we just say, if you want to leave, no problem, the state will buy, and we expand our public housing. It needs to be expanded right across the country. I want to raise also the cases of illegal eviction which are taking place in this country, and where the Gardaí are doing precisely what was depicted in Spice Bag's art, which was so much condemnation of the Gardaí standing by while families were being evicted. Look what happened in Waterford about a month ago. Aaron Madigan and his fiancée Grace got a notice of termination. They contacted CATU, they contacted Threshold. They were able to find out their actual rights as tenants, regardless of the disingenuous and wrong contract supposing that they were licensees. And they were able to say, they disputed with the RTB, and they were able to say that they hadn't, this is an illegal eviction. There wasn't a correct notice period served, no correct eviction, and so on. Men showed up to evict them, kicked down their door. They were illegally trying to break into their home. They called the Gardaí. That's what you're recommended to do. And the Gardaí arrived and brought the men into their home and helped facilitate the eviction. It's an absolute scandal that Gardaí are being used to facilitate illegal evictions in the state. There was no statement by Drew Harris about that. There was no action to prevent that illegal eviction. And it shows whose side this state is on, and it's certainly not on the side of renters.
Mr. Whoever thought the idea of lifting the eviction ban was a good idea needs to reflect, and in this case it was your government. Because since the eviction ban was lifted, hundreds of families are now in emergency accommodation. That's a fact. And they should not be in that situation. But you have created that situation. And you've created it for thousands of other families. And this stems back from the policy of Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil in relation to a market-led approach rather than an approach of citizens. And you know, we've seen other countries, particularly say Austria, where they have a better, much better system of public housing, and not looking to the market. And I mean, so you speak on this issue day in, day out, year on, year out, year in, and the situation gets worse. In the last couple of months, I've had about 15 to 20 individual families coming into our office, speaking about the heartache and the trauma about a notice to quit. And then, in the latter day, them families probably, maybe 5-10 years ago, could have actually gone back into the rental market. But that situation is not the case now. In fact, the majority of them families now will go into emergency accommodation. And that's a fact. Now, you've allowed that to happen, and you continue to allow it to happen. And the trauma and the stress that comes with this is incalculable. You just can't put words on this situation where families are now facing a situation where they had a rental accommodation and now they don't know where they're going to go. And the stress that brings on children is unbelievable. And then when families go into emergency accommodation, they could be stuck there for a hell of a long time. Because there's a lottery then in relation to getting rental accommodation. And even the HAP rates. If you have ordinary HAP rates, it's virtually impossible to get any accommodation in Dublin. If you have homeless HAP rates, again, you're chasing the market because it's so inflationary. It's like the situation is the perfect storm in relation to those families and individuals that find themselves in a homeless accommodation. And the real figures are probably beyond 20,000, and it's probably going to get worse. And if you look and track the situation that's happened in the last couple of months, this situation is only going to get worse, Minister. This is only going to get worse because of the situation, of the policy in relation to the eviction ban. And it would make sense that in an emergency accommodation crisis, such as we have in this state, that an eviction ban, where landlords basically evict tenants, usually generally in the case of selling the house, that would be installed for the foreseeable future, until this emergency is lifted. So, Minister, look these are all political choices that your party has made and other parties have made in relation to this situation. This is only going to get worse, and there is a consequence. And the consequences, I mean, obviously we can talk about political consequences, but the most important consequences is for the families that find themselves in this situation, not of their making, but the making of your party and your government. It's as simple as that. And you have to wrestle that with your conscience, that you have put thousands upon thousands of people in emergency accommodation, and the consequences of that, Minister, is incalculable.
Ceann Comhairle.